A young woman borrowed her little sister's boots on a quiet summer afternoon in 1972. Nothing about that moment felt unusual. It was ordinary, familiar, almost forgettable. She stood outside her home in rural Washington, where the roads were made of dirt and the nearest neighbor lived far enough away that silence was normal. She tied the boots, stepped onto a white 10-speed bicycle, and rode slowly into the warm afternoon sun. Her destination was simple: a horse stable just 6 miles away. A place she had been many times before. A place she was expected to return from. But something happened on that road. Something no one saw. Something no one heard. And something that would change an entire family forever. Because she never made it to the stable. She never returned home that evening. And by the time the sun went down over those quiet Washington woods, she was already gone. At first, it looked like a disappearance. A missing person case. Something that might be solved in days. Maybe weeks. But days turned into months. Months turned into years. And years turned into decades. Until the case stopped being urgent. And started being forgotten. But what investigators didn't know at the time was this. The truth about what happened to her was never lost. It was sitting inside an evidence room the entire time, hidden in something so small that dozens of people looked right past it for nearly 40 years. A stain on a boot. A stain that no one understood. A stain that would one day speak louder than every suspect, every theory, and every dead end combined. And when it finally did, it exposed a killer who had been living just miles away all along. Before we go deeper into this case, take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case 247. Because what you are about to hear is not just a story about murder. It is a story about time, silence, and a single piece of evidence that refused to stay buried. Viewer discretion is advised. On the afternoon of August 23, 1972, 20-year-old Jody Lummis stood at her family home in Snohomish County, Washington. Back then, the area looked nothing like it does today. It was rural. Isolated. Dirt roads cut through thick forest. Houses were scattered far apart. And long stretches of land were empty enough that a scream could disappear into the trees without anyone hearing it. Jody lived with her parents, her fiancé, and her younger sister, Jana, who was just 12 years old at the time. She was described as lively, responsible, and deeply connected to animals, especially horses. That day, she planned to ride to a stable where she kept her horse, Saudi. It was about 6 miles away. Normally, she would have driven. But something was different that afternoon. Instead of taking a car, she chose her bicycle. A white 10-speed. Before leaving, she asked her younger sister if she could borrow a pair of waffle stomper boots. Jana agreed. It was a simple moment between sisters. Something ordinary. Something forgettable. Something that would later become unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, Jody left home. The sun was still high. The weather was calm. And there was nothing unusual about the ride ahead of her. She pedaled down Penny Creek Road, heading toward the stable. She never made it. Somewhere along that quiet stretch of road, everything changed. Minutes turned into silence. Silence turned into tragedy. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Around half an hour later, a young couple driving through the area turned off onto a dirt track branching into the forest. They had come there for something harmless. Target practice. They wanted an isolated spot in the woods where they could shoot at cans. But instead of bottles and trees, they found something they would never forget. A young woman lying on the ground. Barely clothed. Severely injured. And still alive, but fading fast. She had suffered a gunshot wound just above her right ear. a small caliber round. The couple immediately rushed to help her. They lifted her into their vehicle without hesitation. There was no time to think. No time to wait. They drove as fast as they could towards Stevens Memorial Hospital. But despite their efforts, it was already too late. Jody Lummis was pronounced dead on arrival. She was 20 years old. And her future ended in the back seat of a stranger's car. At the crime scene, investigators quickly began reconstructing what had happened. The evidence told a disturbing story. Jody had likely been forced off the road at gunpoint. She was taken into the woods. Far from visibility. Far from help. There, she was sexually assaulted. And at some point during the attack, she attempted to get dressed again. That was when the killer fired the shot that ended her life. Her bicycle was later found abandoned along the dirt track. Her clothing was recovered and carefully packaged. And among those items were the boots she had borrowed from her younger sister. Everything was logged, labeled, and stored. And then, like so many cases of that era, the investigation slowly began to lose momentum. In the days that followed, detectives canvassed the area. They spoke with locals. They looked at men who lived nearby. Some were known to behave inappropriately. Some were seen in the general area around the time of the crime. But suspicion alone does not solve a murder. And no matter how many names they collected, nothing ever connected cleanly to the evidence. There were no fingerprints that matched a suspect. No witnesses who saw the attack itself. No physical trace that directly identified a killer. And so, the case stalled. Weeks became months. Months became years. And eventually, the file was placed into storage. Not closed. But forgotten. Locked away with hundreds of other unsolved cases waiting for answers that never came. But for one family, the case never stopped. Because for Jana Lummis, the night her sister never came home became the dividing line of her entire life. She was only 12 years old when Jody left on that bicycle. She remembered everything. The normalcy of that afternoon. The boots she lent her sister. The quiet expectation that she would return later that evening. But she never did. And after that day, nothing in the house felt the same again. Jody's room remained untouched for a long time. Her belongings stayed where she left them. Even the scent of her presence seemed frozen in time. If you're still watching, leave a comment saying, "I'm still here," so we can see who is truly following these cold cases all the way. Her family tried to survive the loss, but grief like that does not fade. It settles. It lingers. It becomes part of the house. Part of the air. Part of every holiday, every birthday, every empty chair at the table. Years passed. Jana grew into adulthood. She married and became Jana Lummis Smith. But she never stopped carrying her sister's story. She contacted law enforcement repeatedly. She attended updates whenever they were given. She refused to let Jody become just another forgotten name in a file cabinet. And even as decades passed, she held on to hope that one day, someone would finally find the truth. The years stretched into silence. Her parents eventually passed away without answers. They spent their entire lives waiting for justice that never arrived. And still, the case remained cold. Until everything changed. In 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf reopened the file. He began reviewing every piece of evidence with modern perspective. What earlier investigators had missed, he now examined with fresh eyes. And then, years into his review, a discovery was made that would completely transform the case. A technician examining Jody's evidence noticed something unusual on the outside of one of the boots. A stain. Small. Overlooked. Ignored for decades. It had been sitting in evidence storage for 36 years without anyone recognizing its significance. When finally tested, it revealed something extraordinary. biological material. And within it, DNA from the person responsible for Jodi's murder. For the first time since 1972, the case had a genetic lead. But there was a problem. The DNA had no match. It was entered into national databases. It was compared against millions of profiles. And nothing came back. The killer's identity remained unknown. Time continued to pass. The evidence sat in the system. Waiting. Searching. But finding nothing. Years later, investigators turned to a new method. Genetic genealogy. Instead of looking for criminals directly, this method looks for relatives. Distant connections. Shared ancestry. Tiny overlaps in DNA that can lead back to a family tree. The unknown profile was uploaded into public genealogy databases. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Matches appeared. Not direct hits. But relatives. Second cousins. Third cousins. Branches of a family spread across generations. A specialist began building a massive family tree from those connections. Piece by piece. Name by name. Record by record. Until a narrow path began to form. All signs pointed toward a family living in the Edmonds area. Investigators now had something they had never had before. Direction. Not a name. But a target. And that was enough. In August of 2018, investigators quietly followed a man linked to the family tree. They observed his movements. They watched him enter a casino. They watched him order coffee. And when he finished, they watched him discard the cup. That cup became the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. It was collected and sent for testing. When the results returned, everything changed. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the boot stain. The statistical probability of coincidence was nearly 1 in a billion. After 46 years, the identity of the killer was finally known. His name was Terrence Miller. For decades, he had lived a quiet life not far from the crime scene. He raised a family. Worked. Blended into his surroundings. All while the truth waited in a storage room, untouched and unnoticed. Investigators later learned that his history included disturbing allegations stretching back years before and after the murder. But he had never been convicted in a way that would place him in a DNA database. Which is why he remained invisible for so long. Until science finally caught up. He was arrested in April of 2019. At 77 years old, he was charged with first-degree murder. But the case was not finished yet. The trial began in late October of 2020. Prosecutors laid out the entire timeline. From the boot, to the DNA, to the genealogy, to the coffee cup. Each piece building on the last. A chain that pointed in only one direction. The defense argued contamination. They claimed the evidence had been mishandled over decades. That time had corrupted reliability. That science alone could not be trusted after so many years. But the jury had to decide whether the chain still held. Whether the truth survived the passage of time. During the trial, Jana finally took the stand. Nearly 50 years after losing her sister, she faced the courtroom. She described the lifetime of grief. The unanswered questions. The absence that never left. And the years of waiting for justice that had taken so long to arrive. Then something unexpected happened. Before the verdict could be read, Terrence Miller died by suicide. He was 78 years old. The jury did not know. They continued deliberations. And later that day, they reached a verdict. Guilty. The evidence had spoken. Even after decades, even after death, the truth had held its ground. Later, attempts were made to overturn the conviction, arguing that his death before the verdict invalidated the outcome. But the court refused. The conviction stood. And for the first time in nearly half a century, Jody Lummis's family had an answer. Not the one they wanted, but the one they had been denied for so long. Jody was only 20 years old when she left home on a bicycle ride that never ended. And though her life was taken in an instant, the truth of what happened to her refused to disappear. It waited. Hidden in evidence. Hidden in time. Until it was finally uncovered. If this story moved you, subscribe to Cold Case 247 for more real unsolved mysteries, solved cold cases, and true crime documentaries that time tried to forget. Because some stories don't end when the case goes cold. They end when the truth finally speaks.